Welcome to St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jeremy Goodwin. Do you emoji? Those little smiley faces and icons that are probably available in your phone's text messaging app can add fun and color to an online conversation, but they add uncertainty too. When are they a handy shortcut, and when do they make you look bad? And what about using them at work? We have three experts joining me today to talk about emoji etiquette and other sometimes confusing aspects of online communication. They are, on the phone, Amber Hinesley. She's an associate professor in SLU's Department of Communication. In the studio, we have rhetorician Lauren Turbrick-Elmstead, and that does, by the way, mean she's an expert in rhetoric. She's also a PhD student and a graduate instructor at St. Louis University. And Tyler Kelly, he's a co-founder and chief strategist at the St. Louis-based digital marketing firm SLAM. Amber, Lauren, and Tyler, welcome to the program.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Amber, on the phone, what's an emoji?
So emoji are the little smiley faces and other icons, like you said, that we primarily use in text and emails that help give context or cues about the intent of our written words. For me, from a communication standpoint, they're helpful for deciphering the intent of those written words when we can't rely on verbal and nonverbal cues. Like, for example, it's really hard to see sarcasm in words on the screen, so emoji can help the sender and receiver of those messages better understand what's really being said. Kind of a fun fact with this is that actually emoji are the descendants, so to speak, of another term that people may be familiar with, and that's emoticons. Those were the smiley faces that we would use, that we'd make using keys on our keyboards, like by using the colon, the dash, and the in parentheses to make smiley faces. So emojis grew out of those as the technology developed to let us create the little icons that we see today.
And it's too complicated to try to have an all-text version of, like, chef kissing fingers, right? We need the actual picture to communicate, whatever that means.
Right. It helps add context to things. So. Yeah.
Lauren, so are these conversational shortcuts, or do they cause miscommunication?
Well, I think I think going back to what Amber said about nonverbal cues is really important, because one of the biggest gripes about say texting or emailing is it's hard to convey tone. And so adding that visual vocabulary tends to, in my experience, it expands our sense of what the message actually is. And so, but I also, for myself as a rhetorician, I'm also interested in the question, not just is it helping or hindering our communication, but kind of why we have these anxieties about it. You know, from my perspective, anything that widens our ability to communicate with our audience, I think is always a good thing. So.
Well, Elizabeth writes on Facebook, I have never understood why people will end a complete sentence with an ellipsis, the ... And I think that gets to the idea that we've got the shared language here, but people are using it in different ways. We don't necessarily agree on what the words mean, so to speak. Tyler, I know you've thought a lot about this. How do people navigate that?
Well, you know, I love the idea of visuals providing, emojis providing feeling and emotion, because that's something, as you say, is lost in just words on a screen, the tone, the feeling. And so to be able to convey an emotion through an emoji, through, you know, the ellipsis, which means to be continued, or this thought is just running, right? I think it's an interesting dynamic that is important in today's communication.
And there's a hierarchy of all different, depending on what social media app you're using or what text messaging program you're using, there's sort of different options, a hierarchy of ways to react to something. Say on Facebook, am I going to give this a thumbs up, or am I going to give it a heart? And what do I mean by one versus the other? And does the other person know what I mean by one versus the other? But there isn't a guide anywhere that sort of stipulates what all these things are saying. Amber, is that part of this? How do people work their way through just finding a common understanding here?
Right. And so one of the things we have to keep in mind is that for the most common emojis, we have a shared understanding and a shared meaning for what those are. But for other ones, we don't. And so in terms of best practices, I would say stick with using the common emojis like the smileys and the thumbs up. But with friends, that's where you're getting into kind of a subculture and subtext, and people will use emojis for inside jokes and things like that. But best practice again is if you're not for sure what the emoji means, don't use it.
Amber, what emoji are most prone to misunderstanding?
A lot of time, and this is again, like, we can't see sarcasm on the screen, with written words. But again, sometimes you can put in, for example, something that often gets mistaken is what looks like jazz hands. You hold your hands up and your fingers are splayed out.
Yes.
That's an emoji. That actually means you're giving someone a hug. And so you may look at that and think, oh, it's jazz hands, I'm being funny, when in actuality you may have just sent your supervisor at work a hug, which might land you in HR.
Is there is there a definitive guide when a new batch of emoji come out that say this is how you're supposed to use them?
On Slack, there's...
Amber, we'll hear from Tyler for a moment. Tyler?
On Slack, you can hover. Slack is a popular communications tool in the workplace, so you can hover over each emoji, and it gives you a short definition of what it is.
Amber, is that enough? Does that help?
Well, if you're using Slack, it does. I sort of joke that if you have access to a teenager, that can be helpful. But, there's this wonderful thing called the internet, and that can be really helpful in helping figure out what some of those things are. And also sometimes what the subculture, the subtext meanings are on things, to make sure you're not accidentally sending someone something that has an entirely different meaning than what you think.
I was just going to add, there's also something that I learned recently in a group chat that I'm in on Facebook Messenger, that depending upon if you're on an iPhone or an Android, they look different as well. So I've been in situations where I've sent a certain emoji and then someone said, why did you send? And they would tell me, like, they would describe it to me, that's not what I sent you. But because I'm on an iPhone and they're on an Android, it makes a difference as well.
And even if you're just talking about a smiley face, I feel a little more comfortable typing it out if I'm in a conversation where I think it's appropriate. Whereas if I'm on Slack, which is another social media a chat tool, the face looks a little more silly than I want it to look. And then if I'm on a different app, if I'm on GroupMe, which is a similar app to that, it looks way too silly. And it's the same smiley face. So I'm trying to just say something here, and I'm not sure how it's going to be received. Lauren, is that something you've run into?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that, so going back to the question about, if you're on Facebook, am I going to like this? Am I going to love this? Or, is it too much if I put a ha-ha? I think the pressure to reciprocate is that's become an increasing problem with this digital communication, that if somebody sends me an emoji, should I send them one back? And it's kind of like, well, if they send me a smiley face, do I send them the same smiley face or do I send them a different smiley face? Right. So I think that these pressures of kind of like validation and reciprocation have definitely increased with our emoji use.
Well, if folks happened to miss this last week, we did have World Emoji Day on Wednesday. I didn't have that on my calendar, but I've since caught up with that. Can you believe it's World Emoji Day again already? It seems like it was just yesterday. But along with that, the software giant Adobe released its first ever emoji trend report. There's a lot of fun info in there, including the top 3 most popular emoji. Would anyone like to take a gander at what would you say those are?
Well, my first instinct is I think, was it in 2015 that the Oxford English Dictionary had declared the crying laughing face as like the word of the year? So I would say that
the emoji of the laughing crying face was the word of the year in 2015.
I think so. I mean, don't quote me on that,
right.
But yeah.
Tyler.
Well, we can't talk about emojis without talking about the poop emoji.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Okay,
yeah.
That's a popular one. Amber, do you have a sense of the most popular emoji?
I'm going to say thumbs up.
Thumbs. I would think so too. According to this, the crying with laughter emoji was the one that gets used the most. After that, the heart, mind you, the red heart, not the green heart or the black heart, and then the kissy face. And I think we're all mixing a little tears in with our laughter, or laughter in with our tears these days. So that sounds appropriate to me. We'll talk in a few minutes about emoji at work, but let's linger a little more on talking with friends or with people in your extended circles. Tyler, someone posts some sad news on Facebook. Their dog died. Sometimes I want to hit like to indicate that I've read it or I'm showing support, or click the heart to show that like my heart is going out to them, but that actually means I love it. So I don't know what message I'm sending. How do people deal with that?
That's an interesting dilemma. I would say in those cases, it's best just to leave a thoughtful message rather than an emoji where, that doesn't necessarily take any thought.
Mm-hmm. So there's even a hierarchy of the kind of comment you meant.
Perhaps.
Right? If you take the time to write out a few words, that might be a little more meaningful than if you're just clicking like.
Exactly.
And similar thing on Twitter. I know some years ago, folks used to like a tweet just so it would be in their list of likes so they could then go back and find it later to read it, like if it were a link. But then they realized that people are saying, oh, this person liked this terrible article that says this terrible thing. And then there's retweeting, right? People like to put retweets are not endorsement in the bio, but that doesn't come along with the retweet. Does it mean you like it? Are you endorsing it? Or you just want people to – there's all this stuff to sort through, right?
Exactly. In a marketing sense, liking, retweeting, liking on Facebook, hearting, these are ways to get people's attention. So a lot of times brands will go through and like and heart and retweet just so that they'll get noticed. And so you really shouldn't read anything into that.
Mm-hmm. In that study I'm sorry, Amber, what do you have?
Oh, I was just going to add to that, that I've done some research with how people do cognitive differentiation between liking something and retweeting it and things like that, and especially looking at like crisis information. And people are far more likely to retweet information about some kind of crisis or emergency than they are to heart it or to like it, because they don't want to be seen as liking this terrible thing that's happened.
So this is in people's heads.
Yes, very much so.
This is out there. In that emoji trend report from Adobe, heavy emoji users said they use them to lighten the mood of conversations and also to show support for the person that they're talking to. How can emoji help with those sorts of things, Lauren?
Well, I think going back to using this visual vocabulary in interpersonal communication, it can give us a better connection when we have that. What Amber had mentioned, the kind of like a subculture, that more intimate interpersonal connection. So I think emoji becomes its own language. And while we do have universal understandings of the symbols, at a certain point with your friends or with your close circle, your family, you start to develop your own systems of them. So, I have a friend who finishes all of her texts with a winky kissy emoji to me, right? And I always send like a heart back, no matter what it is. And so developing that connection is, I think it deepens our communication in some way.
Okay, we do need to take a short break, so we're going to do that, but we will be back shortly to continue this conversation. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, saluting Earth Day on April 22nd with an ongoing commitment to help offset carbon emissions with sustainable harvesting of Missouri forests. Details at choosewood.com.
Welcome back. We return now to our conversation about emoji. With me today are three St. Louisans to talk about it. St. Louis University faculty member Amber Hinesley, SLU doctoral student Lauren Turbrick-Elmstead, and SLAM agency co-founder Tyler Kelly. Actually, we should mention, emoji technically is meant to function as both a singular and a plural word, but a lot of people say emojis, and we're not going to hold that against anyone, right? That's just a little more comfortable. But I guess either way, if you're wondering, either way we'll say is correct. But technically, you're supposed to just say emoji. Tyler, can I use an emoji when I send an email to my boss?
If you're using your phone and Gmail, then a lot of times if you're typing it out, the emoticon, then it might translate it into an emoji.
Okay.
Yeah, that it happens automatically. At least I've noticed that recently.
So forces are sort of nudging us toward using this, even if we didn't do it as a matter of intent.
I think so. Last stat was like over 90% of people use emojis, over a third daily.
Amber, someone's use of emoji in their text messages or in their emails, does that affect how people view them?
Absolutely, especially in a workplace context. You always want to let your boss or your other superiors or your clients set the standard for what types of emoji are appropriate, or even if emoji are seen as being appropriate, because this is going to vary from organization to organization. And so especially if you're someone new in the workplace, you want to try to get a read on what the organizational culture is regarding emojis. And so it's always a safer bet to skip the emoji until you're sure. And obviously for everyone, emojis shouldn't replace basic communication skills because that, like I said, can hurt your credibility. And we mentioned Slack earlier and some Google apps. You consider the platform. And so it's more acceptable to use an emoji in one of those social media types of platforms than in a presentation.
Yeah. And we use, in the newsroom here at St. Louis Public Radio, we use Slack, which is a group messaging tool. And I think folks are so serious the rest of the time, we might sort of blow some steam off by using tons of emoji when we're talking among coworkers at a similar level. But it sounds to me, Amber, like this is some of the same advice folks might have given about how to dress in the workplace, the same sorts of etiquette issues, but people are entering the workforce from different generations with different social media habits and might not be cognizant of the fact they need to modify the way they communicate.
Right. I mean, it's the same way that we tell people, don't always have your cell phone in your hand and make eye contact. That's one of the chief complaints, especially with communication skills among people who are coming out of college and entering the workforce, is lacking some of those basic sorts of interpersonal skills. And this is just another variation of that.
So if emoji use can affect the way one person views another person, what about when companies wade into this? Does emoji use tend to fit into a company's broader strategy in terms of their brand identity, Tyler?
I think so. I think that, right now or a few years ago, Google made emojis searchable. So emoji campaigns have become more popular. You're starting to see.
What's an emoji campaign?
It's a campaign where, like, for instance, Domino's Pizza, with the pizza emoji, they created a campaign in Twitter where they had like a slice of pizza made out of pizza emoji. And they blasted that all over Twitter, along with, a coupon or, a call to action.
And how can pizza users use that emoji?
It's more about grabbing attention. Okay. So in a platform that's primarily text, 7 or 8 lines of emoji pizza get noticed.
But didn't they also set up something where you can text a pizza emoji somewhere and they'll deliver you a pizza? Was that a Domino's promotion?
I'm not sure, but it sounds like a good deal.
That's floating in my head somewhere. That might have been a temporary kind of thing. But I'd be sending that everywhere. Just see what shows up, right?
There you go.
I'd be sending Chinese food emoji just willy-nilly. Wait for a knock on the door. So in that Adobe survey I mentioned a couple times, it just came out last week about emoji use among emoji users, and of folks who are conversant with emoji and like to use them, 58% said they're more likely to open an email from a brand that has an emoji in the subject line. So Tyler, when you're trying to tell a brand story and communicate with the audience, are you thinking hard about how to use these tools as part of your communication?
Of course. Everything is about attention. I mean, that's the first layer. So how can I grab your attention? If it's in the email subject line, you probably have 10 or 20 emails there in the updates or the promotions tab if you're using Gmail. And if, mine has a vomit emoji, then maybe that will grab your attention. And if I can get you to open that email, then I've done my job with that subject line.
Amber, how would you react to that vomit emoji in the subject?
I guess it depends upon what you're trying to say, right?
Yeah.
But no, I think that's absolutely true. And it just, humans, by nature, we're visual creatures. And so that's part of the reason why those types of things can be more effective. But with everything, it's, you run the risk of overuse. And so you just, as Tyler said, you want to be strategic with how you're using these so that people don't go, oh, I got another email from this, this company that's trying to sell me something or trying to get me to do something. And look, they've used a whole bunch of emojis, or they're using the same emojis, or they're using the same emojis as their competitor. So just, there's a lot to be aware with that, especially when you're using it on behalf of an organization.
Yeah, and I think we're talking largely about the corporate world here. But Lauren, what about in the academic world? Is there fewer emoji being tossed around, or more, or similar?
Well, I think for myself, I've taught at multiple higher education institutions, and I think there's always the inevitable kind of like dinner party conversation when I tell people what it is I do, and there's always the, kids these days can't write. And my response is actually, yeah, sure they can. That's actually not my that's not my experience. What's interesting to me is as emojis do become more common in the academic world, especially like on academic Twitter or something like that, I don't find it to be hindering students' ability to write or their ability to learn how to communicate effectively in different situations, be it a professional setting or interpersonal communication. What I've actually seen happen with students is they're able to have a broader sense of their rhetorical situation when it's appropriate to use emoji, when it's appropriate not to use emoji. They are able to pick up on those nonverbal cues and understand whether or not it's appropriate in that situation. So, I have in an older version of curriculum I taught, we had students do advocacy projects where they would choose an issue within St. Louis, and they would do research and write about it throughout the semester in different iterations. And even though we kind of have this, emoji use or text language is eroding our ability to communicate in face-to-face interactions, I've actually noticed students can actually write intelligently and compellingly about a topic, and then they can turn around and turn it into a social media campaign, and they know how to, and I think that they have a tendency to teach me about the sensibilities to those situations.
We've talked a lot about the social mores of this and professional norms, but it's really interesting to hear you talk about this in the context of the art of rhetoric, which is what, using words to persuade?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean that would be a generalized way to describe it. Yeah, just and not just persuasion in terms of how to get people to think differently, right? Rhetoric is actually about action, right? Getting people to do things. So if you are able to use emoji to get people to open up an email, it's rhetorically powerful.
Do we tend to see, you mentioned that the more it gets used on academic Twitter, do we see the conventions about what's appropriate in an environment sort of filter down from social media somewhere into an actual academic setting or a workplace setting? Does language loosen up because of what happens on social media? Any thoughts on that, Tyler or Lauren?
I'd say yes. I'd say that increasingly where there used to be a clear separation between work life and personal life in terms of norms, I think there's starting to see a blurring of the lines. And that's because culture really does influence the day-to-day, because all work is personal. People are people in work and outside of work, that this is the way we communicate. And therefore, even if it's not corporately acceptable at this point, in a few years it will be, because it's just the way we communicate.
So, Lauren, to summarize, emoji are not eroding young people's ability to communicate?
I would not say so, no. And I think that, so going back to what Tyler was just saying, there's still a large demand for people to communicate in a fairly narrow definition of what professional is, or, it's a kind of a narrow, privileged definition of what professional communication is. So what I'm interested in is seeing how emoji use or text language, things like that, actually kind of like bidirectionally shift what we consider to be professional. As people use these things more frequently, will it actually change what we consider to be the workplace?
Mm-hmm. And Amber, you're generally a proponent of integrating new ways of digital communication just into our professional lives and our lives to use it positively. Would that be fair to say?
Sure. In terms of thinking about what's appropriate, like everyone else has said, is, I wouldn't advocate using emojis in place of sentences, or that your sentences shouldn't contain more emoji than words, but thinking of them more as slang, and but more and more that's becoming socially acceptable in all types of arenas.
Finally, some folks experience actual anxiety about how to use these tools, whether they're communicating on Facebook or they just received a text message from someone. Any advice for folks who are trying to navigate that? Lauren, any thoughts?
I'm an actual terrible person to ask that question to, because I experience that. A lot of it comes from my own attempts at inclusion. I want to make sure that everyone's voices are heard and everyone feels validated, but that gets us into some situations sometimes where you don't always want to acknowledge a particular message. So, in terms of advice, I would say, don't feel pressured to respond to every single thing, because it'll really wear you down. But at the same time, I understand that drive to acknowledge everything.
Tyler, did you want to chip something in there?
I would just say that if your sense is that you're going to be misinterpreted to the negative, then maybe, take a step back and don't do that. But if you could be misinterpreted to the positive, then go ahead and do it. You learn from it.
Yeah, I think much as one wouldn't necessarily want to use a word that you didn't know what it meant just because someone else used it, maybe don't reply with that same huggy emoji or kissy emoji or heart emoji unless you're quite sure everyone's on the same page.
Exactly.
People are nodding their heads. Is that just a fair way to try to wade your way through?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
But then when your kid or your parent sends a text message that completely misuses it, do we bother to explain it or just sort of move along?
In my experience, I just move along, but I'm also not one to correct people's grammar in text messages, even though people always, that's what they anticipate from me.
Mm-hmm. They anticipate the correction?
Yes. Yeah. Because of my profession.
Well, this is terrific. We are out of time for this segment, but I want to thank all three of you so much for joining us today. Amber Hinesley, Associate Professor in SLU's Department of Communication, rhetorician Lauren Turberg-Elmstead, PhD student and a graduate instructor over there at SLU, and Tyler Kelly, he's co-founder and chief strategist at the St. Louis-based digital marketing firm SLAM, with an exclamation point, right?
That's right.
So we're very careful with our language. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, saluting Earth Day on April 22nd with an ongoing commitment to help offset carbon emissions with sustainable harvesting of Missouri forests. Details at choosewood.com.